When you start from an old presentation. Well, I'm not going to speak about results of measurement of open access. We've been doing quite some work on this starting in 2012, doing some work for the European Commission at Science Metrics, and we're currently doing some work also for the NSF that will go into the science and engineering indicators. I thought it would be more relevant today to speak about perhaps the challenges of measuring some aspects of open access. Downloads were traditionally very important. I think actually open access creates some kind of measurement nightmares in every respect, starting with downloads. That in the past, that was fairly easy to download because to measure because it was coming from a few sources. Typically, you would have the publisher having the articles, and then they would be downloaded from there. Then progressively, we had a bit more sources with the aggregators, but now we have an explosion of sources. I mean, if you think of with the effect of self-archiving, think of a paper on the Large Hadron Collider, where you have 2,500 authors. Now, if only half of them decide to self-archive the paper where they feel like, then it creates a huge problem knowing how many times these papers were downloaded. The problem is that currently there's no standard on download data exchanges between publishers, no place to aggregate this. So basically, we have no idea how many downloads in total are being made. And again, increasingly, we're going to have an explosion of these sources. If you have papers being diffused with a simple CC BY or CC 0 license, then chances are that they're going to be rediffused from some 100 different places. And that affects actually all other types of measurement that comes following measuring downloads. So not only downloads, but also other types of measures. So of course, the metrics are still relevant. Downloads, yeah, you can find the initial source of the download, the publisher that made it happen, and measure it there. But it doesn't necessarily tell you much because you don't know, again, all the rediffusion. So it becomes relevant to measure the number of rediffusion points and to start having a clue on how much they are contributing to diffusion. And also the type of rediffusion points, because they're not all created equal. For example, I was mentioning in terms of aggregators above, you have the commercial aggregators, of course, the traditional one, EBSCO, ProQuest, and all that. But also you've got new types of aggregation. For example, PubMed Central is rediffusing a lot of the papers, and perhaps in some cases, that's going to be even more important than the initial source. So these are potentially very important, and they're different as the search engines. For example, Google is not rediffusing, it's barely pointing, so the sources are still relevant as a unit of measurement. It's not so much Google, but PMC is starring the paper, so it's really properly a rediffusion point. And it's the same thing with an institutional repository. When you want to measure the impact now, and when I say impact, being a good old bibliometrician, of course, I'm thinking of citations. Okay, so we're not speaking of social impacts, we're just speaking about scholarly impact, the impact within the scholarly community, which is what is captured by citation. It's an important source of impact, but of course it doesn't say everything. So, and then of course, we're thinking of articles and journals. So it's important to distinguish what is strictly available through subscriptions, okay? So what isn't self-archived, what isn't available as delayed open access, and so forth. But also it's important to distinguish, and all of these categories create some new kinds of challenges. Measuring the impact of a journal, knowing, or of articles, knowing whether they allow self-archiving or not, changes completely the game. And then born gold journals and articles, hybrid gold open access articles are a challenge to measure. Very frequently they're difficult to even go and get at, and among the regular subscription-based articles on the publisher's site. The delayed open access, and then the green open access. And the green open access, of course, mixes up with all these categories except for the first one, because the first one you're saying it didn't become green, which is in itself a challenge. How do you know the paper didn't appear in a repository somewhere else? That's in itself, it's a big measurement problem. So the downloads are important when you want to measure the impact. If you had a sense of how many downloads you had, how many rediffusion points, it would already help you understand the pattern of citations. Because measuring citations in themselves without understanding how you come to get larger number of citations or not is really important. And of course there's the question of the journals. So impacts are challenging to measure. There could be different behavior following article quality. There's a lot of people who speak about some selective behavior, that researchers would self-archive better papers as opposed to the ones that are not as good. And I would think there's some evidence to that, although it's sketchy. We don't have systematic studies, but I know in our work we can see, for example, what's published in Nature and Science makes its way on the internet. So people who end up publishing in these journals are so proud of their articles, they make sure that people know about them. And I would think if you just publish something thinking, okay, I need to publish a paper because, you know, it's my 25th this year and I need this quota, then perhaps you won't make as much efforts. And there are some of course, different challenges with different study protocols. The experimental protocol, and we don't have many studies that were made with experimental protocols to date, and I don't think we had anything that is really truly satisfying. They need to be conducted over several years, and they need to measure rediffusion points to account for green OA. If you don't do this, it's very difficult to really speak about open access. And the observational studies, well, they have the problem, as I just mentioned before, of the selective behavior relative to the quality of the paper that could taint this. So you have to find some ways of controlling. And of course, there are some huge sampling issues. You know, how do you do a sample to be able to measure OA? The problem is that we don't have a truly comprehensive database. At the moment, what we have, if you think of the Web of Science and Scopus, these are selective bibliographic database. They are picking up the best journals, which means that they're not a random sample of the population to start with. So you count sample in there and say it represents the overall population. And it's especially a big problem because they claim in large part to incorporate the most highly cited journals. Now, if you start a journal, an open access journals, and most of the journals that are starting from scratch nowadays are actually gold journals. If you start a journal, you're not going to get citations from the first day. So you're not going to be incorporated, which means that there's a disproportionate proportion of the newer journals which are not covered in the Web of Science and in Scopus. So that's a big problem. Sampling is huge. Then when you think of journal level metrics, it's also problematic. How is green, hybrid, and delayed OA affecting journal metrics? I think it's very important to know that. I think we need some studies in there because some publishers are reluctant to allow self-archiving, for example. They think it's going to basically harm the subscriptions. But if they have evidence on the contrary, that by allowing self-archiving, you improve your journal impact factor produced by the mecca of impact factors, the journal citation report, perhaps they would be more open to it. So we need to understand better what is green OA's impact, what is the impact of hybrid OA. Today, the few studies we have are not clear on the impact of hybrid OA. And honestly, I don't understand completely why it's the case. But I suspect that one of the reasons is that they didn't take into account the full effect of the redistribution points. If you have something hybrid, again, it depends on the license, and that's something I haven't discussed. What is the effect of having different license on the papers? And typically, the journal impact factor was measured with a citation window of 2 years, okay? And now Elsevier is coming with a third way of measuring the impact of journals, and they have a citation window of 3 years. Now, is this sufficient if you really want to take into account things like delayed open access? If a journal has a period of 1 year or 2 years when it's only subscription-based, and we have a citation window of 2 years to measure the impact, we're completely missing out on the effect of having delayed open access for a journal relative to being completely closed. So I think this is potentially problematic. And also potentially, open access extends the life of a paper. For example, it could have a first life when it's strictly available through subscription, and then it could have a second life when it starts being diffused through other means and through other places in the world. So that's also a problem. So when we think of, again, the impact of journals, usually it's measured with the citations. And the question here is, which one do we measure? Again, we have a problem with the databases we have. The databases are not encompassing. So if the newer journals are not included in the index of what should be counted as the citations, then of course they're self-penalized. Because the self-citation of a journal are always important. Some people see this as cheating, but I don't agree. There's always a part of self-citation that occurs naturally in scholarly work. A researcher needs to cite its own work frequently because that's the specialist in the field. There's no one else working in there. So you need to self-cite. You need to recognize your own work. A university that is at the top of its domain needs to self-cite because, again, they contributed most of the old work. And the same thing is also applicable at the level of journals. They tend to be specialized. People will self-cite. Now, there is also some abuse, of course, but this is very important. So the citations, which one we count? We have a problem with the databases, but also increasingly we have a problem because new people are coming with new metrics and they haven't necessarily thought about it. For example, if you have a database now that covers, a fourth of the conferences on the planet, why those should be counted? Frequently, they will measure the conferences in areas which are important in terms of bibliographic input, computer sciences, that kind of things. So they will have more conferences. So you can have completely distorted views of your citation if you decide to include those conferences, but the rest is excluded. Books, what are we doing with books? Now, Google comes and start measuring citations And as the good old tradition of Google, everything's a black box. Don't even ask questions. You can't know what they're counting or not. I don't like this idea of having citation counts and speaking of the impact of something where you have no clue what's being included or not. So that's a problem. So the effect of references is really a big problem. I think I was more or less done. Sorry, my 5 minutes is taking a bit too long. We always speak of the publishing side. Now open access is changing the game. We will have some new indicators emerging, and now I thought of the crap one. But of course, these are the one I can predict are going to come first. What is your bang for your buck? I'm paying $3,000 APC. Am I going to have some citations for this? So you're going to see people developing some citation per APC predictors. I publish in this journal, I should have 15 citations for my article. So, of course, the APC in itself is not so easy to come by. Different publishers have different APCs, they change over time. We don't have a consolidated database, so it's going to present some challenges just getting the APC costs, which are changing over time and which are often negotiated and sometimes they're waived. So it's going to be fun having systematic studies on this. Of course, as I mentioned, we're going to have people who measure citation per APC or whatever per APC. For users, at some stage, they will want to have a sense of what they're going to buy with $3,000 when they can go to a society journal where the article processing fees are not paid by the users, and hence you don't pay an APC, it's free to publish. So when you divide by 0, it becomes very interesting in terms of your cost per money. So again, we're going to have the same old question, citation, which one to count, citation weighting, because maybe it makes some sense to give more credentials to some credence to some citation from some sources and some from others, and the effect of references. So that was my quick word on the challenges. I think we're going to have a lot of funds in the next few years in the industry and also in bibliometrics and for the users, because there's just so much to understand. We haven't scratched the surface, and that's not an issue that is being discussed all that much considering everything we have to cover. And something that I would think is a bit sad that we're not thinking about it is because the state of open access at any given time disappears from the memory. So we're not going to be able to have some time series. When we'll measure in 2012, in 2022, what's happening, it's going to be what happened in 2022. Even if you look at the old publications, it's not going to tell you what happened to this publication from 2015 in 2015. It's going to be the state of OA of that publication 7 years later. So everything that happened in the meantime, because we don't have instruments, is going to disappear. So I think we have to start thinking about this soon so that we have a better understanding. The publishing industry is a fairly large market. There's a lot of spending on publishing, and because of this, I think we need to measure it correctly so that publishers do better choices, but also the users. Thank you.